Lucidia is a global software developer with a commitment to providing purpose-built collections management systems to galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. Argus is our unrivaled web-based CMS for museums of all sizes and budgets. Argus is engaging, immersive, innovative, essential. Museum collections management limited only by your imagination. Argus.
So sorry. All right, so I think we're getting started. Hi everyone, welcome to Active Collections, What We've Learned. My name is Stacen Goldman. I am the curator at the Framingham History Center. I'm joined today by Annie Murphy, who is the director at the Framingham History Center, and Rainey Tisdale, who is an independent museum professional and one of the developers of the Active Collections concept. So the way that this session is going to be structured today is Rainey is going to walk us through the concept of active collecting. And then Annie and I are going to give you a little background on our own experience implementing active collecting at the History Center. And you'll see from that that the road to an active collection is not always a straight one. Before we begin, first we'd like to acknowledge that Annie and I are speaking to you from the land that is ancestral territory of the Nipmuc people. And Rainey is speaking today from the land that falls within the territory of the Massachusetts people. Furthermore, we would like to acknowledge and honor the traditions of all people indigenous to what is currently known as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The Nipmuc in Massachusetts, as well as the Chappaquiddick, the Pennacook, Wakumtuk, Mohican, Nauset, and Wampanoag. I'm going to throw it to Rainey.
We will get to that at the end, y'all. All right, so great to be with you today. So first of all, in the chat window, if y'all could just give us a sense of yes or no, whether you're familiar with active collections already, with the concept and basically what it's about. And that'll just help us understand our audience today a little bit better. So yes, if you're familiar, no, if you're not. So I do know from looking at the attendee list that there's some folks joining us today who I know have been working with active collections approaches already at their museum. So if you have stuff you want to share, report about what you've been doing at your museum along active collections lines, we'd love for you to put that in the chat either now or as we go along, either way. And I'm going to give you a little background on active collections first, just a basic understanding so we're all on the same page. This is a project that I started around 2011 with Trevor Jones and Ely Wood. We're all folks who have worked with and loved collections throughout our careers. But we were seeing some big problems with the systems that govern museum collections. Basically the whole big picture of collections, our values, our assumptions, our best practices. And it felt like the approach to museum collections had largely stayed the same while the world around us had changed a lot. In fact, museums had changed a lot as well. And we started asking questions and having conversations with our colleagues and doing some conference presentations. And what we found out is that there were lots of people who around the country were seeing the same problems we were. So we kept going. We created this website. There's a link on the slide for you to go to the website. And I think Stacen's dropping in the chat as well. We also ended up making a book with lots of resources about active collections approaches. And bit by bit, active collections has gone from this small project to a movement with folks now like Annie and Stacen who are embracing these concepts and making changes at museums all over the country. And that's just really exciting to see because we feel like it's making the field better. And so our tagline, as you see on the slide, is leaner collections with greater impact. And that means a focus on quality, not quantity. So collections are more sustainable and manageable, while still ensuring that they're providing as much meaning and story and educational potential as possible. I find when I talk about active collections, it's really helpful to start off with sort of a framing of 3 big societal trends that are a big part of the reason our old collections practices are no longer serving us. And so I'm going to run through those so we're all on the same page about it. And the first trend is climate collapse. And so, in terms of collections, first of all, there's no point in holding collections in perpetuity if our plan is no longer sustainable for human habitation. And so we have to make sure our planet is healthy before it even matters to have collections. And so that's one issue. Another issue is that our collections practices, our conventional collections practices, were created during a time when we thought we had unlimited resources. And so we thought we could collect anything we wanted. We could just keep adding more storage if we needed more storage. And we could use as much archival materials as we needed. We could keep making them to house these collections. But now we understand that fossil fuels are limited, very limited, and we have to make hard decisions about what is worth its carbon footprint and what is not. And the example I like to give is that the Declaration of Independence is definitely worth its carbon footprint to preserve it in perpetuity. We would want to make that decision. But there are lots of things we have collected over the years that are not worth their carbon footprint. If we have limited resources, we would decide that some items in our collection simply aren't sustainable. So it's time to make some decisions about that. The next societal trend I want to discuss with you is systemic inequality. This isn't really a trend per se, because systemic inequality has been an issue for hundreds of years, but we are really focused on it. It is imperative to deal with systemic inequality, and we need to understand that most of our museums in the US are museums of privilege with collections of privilege, and that contributes to systemic inequality in ways that we really need to address with our collections. And we can even in a lot of instances read these collections of privilege as microaggressions for a lot of Americans who don't feel represented or don't feel like they belong when they see the collections that we have on display. And I think we've known inequality was an issue with museum collections for a long time. And there was a point when we thought, oh, we can just collect on top of our existing collections of privilege to balance them out. And I think what we're really understanding now is that we need to decenter collections of privilege to make space. And that is going to require paring down what we have. And the third trend that I want to call attention to is hyper-consumerism. We're living at this time in the US where we are just drowning in stuff in our daily lives because of the rise of material goods and cheap material goods. And I know when I show this slide, when we've been doing our practicing, Annie always lights up with a lot of intensity. This is a photograph from a book, Life at Home in the 21st Century, which is documents a study that UCLA did about American middle-class families and what their lives are really like. It was a pretty intensive study. And this is a photo from the garage of one of the families. And in this study, they found that 90% of these families had so much stuff in their garages they could no longer fit their cars. And we know this is not confined to just a study. We know that this is rampant all over America, so much stuff in our daily lives. And so if museums are the keepers of stuff, if we are the experts on stuff, I think it really behooves us now to stop and understand that all of this hyperconsumerism is increasing our cortisol levels. there's a big body of research on this at this point, is getting in the way of our mental health and our physical health, and is sort of forcing us to work really hard every day to earn the money to buy this stuff, which doesn't make us happy. And so what would it mean for museums instead, and collections workers, to be thinking about how to have a healthy relationship with stuff, and how museums can model that? So those are the 3 trends, just to set us up. And then I also want to go over 2 tools that we have started using with the active collections, sort of model, and are finding that they're helpful for museums. And Annie and Stacen are going to talk about them coming up. And so I just want to, sort of set you up to understand those tools. And the first is this concept of a poetic collecting scope statement. And to refresh your memory, your collecting scope is generally part of your collections policy, and it explains what you collect and what you don't collect. And for the most part, collecting scopes tend to be really broad, to give you as much leeway as possible to collect as many things as possible. And that was fine in a time of abundance and unlimited resources and unlimited space for collections. But now we're finding that it's really helpful to have constraints on your collecting scope that help you collect thoughtfully and meaningfully. Again, quality, not quantity. And this is also along the lines of, there's so many museums whose goal had been to have encyclopedic collections, Noah's Ark principle, collect one of everything and a duplicate just in case something happens to the original. And instead, for active collections, we're trying to play with this concept of not encyclopedic collections, but poetic collections. If you think of a poem as something that's very inspirational, very meaningful, but with an economy of words, where you can really crystallize it down. Every word is chosen because it really matters. And so you can think of a poetic collection as one where each piece really matters and packs a punch in terms of mission, in terms of story, in terms of meaning. And so what would it look like to have a collecting scope like that? This is an excerpt from Oyster Pond's Historical Society's new collecting scope. This is an organization I worked with a couple of years ago, and you don't have to take in the whole thing. We've got a handout on the NEMA website, which gives you actually 3 different new poetic collecting scope statements to use as examples and models. And so, but just to give you a sense of the kind of language and the way it might help you really understand what is the real crux of your collection and the stuff that's most important for you to collect. The next tool I want to share with you is a tier chart. And this is an idea for active collections of sorting your collection into tiers. This is pioneered, this approach, at Kentucky Historical Society. Trevor Jones pioneered it there with his team. And so if your collection is sorted into 5 tiers, you can think of the top tier being your most important stuff, the stuff that if the building were burning, you would, grab and run out the door with. And tier 5 being stuff that probably your institution should never have collected in the first place, that really does not serve your mission, is not being used, and in fact probably should be de-accessioned. And then tiers in between that are sort of gradations between those. And then if you do that tiering and you create a chart like this that helps you distinguish which object, each object in which tier it falls into, then that is a great tool for starting to pare down, de-accession the tier 5 and actually often tier 4. And that really helps you focus on your top tiers, the stuff that really matters. And again, the handout that we uploaded to the NEMA site has 3 different examples of tier charts, because, so you can take this general principle and adapt it to your institution. So take a look at those. And then the last thing I'm going to do in my part is share a little inspiration with you that I think is really fitting for our time. I've been thinking a lot over the past few months about the ways that 2020, while it's challenging us so much, is also providing a lot of clarity about what matters and doesn't matter. And in that light, I keep on going back to this collection that you may or may not know about that's halfway around the world, which is, you know, and a little story that goes with it. In 1959, when the Dalai Lama fled Tibet and sought exile in India, in Dharamshala, the Tibetan people hand carried the sacred texts and artifacts of the Buddhist faith across the Himalayas as the Dalai Lama fled into exile. And this is just a film still of the Tibetan people doing that hand carrying. Here's another photo as well, film still. And so bit by bit, those sacred texts and artifacts were reassembled in Dharamshala, India, into what is now the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. And it is so beautiful to see what collection storage looks like here, and so different from our American techniques. There's a shrine in collection storage. And I think this is just a really powerful metaphor to understand. You know, it feels like right here in 2020, we are crossing a mountain, a mountain of a pandemic, a mountain of sort of economic upheaval, of systemic inequality. And we are in the midst of this crossing a mountain as a museum field, trying to figure out what of our old ways we are going to leave behind and what is worth carrying over the mountain. And so that is a question I want you to be asking yourself. What in your collection is worth carrying over a mountain? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stacen and Amy, Stacen and Annie, who are going to tell you how they've been dealing with that in their collection.
All right, Annie, it's you.
Okay, so hi everybody, thank you for joining us. I am the Executive Director of the Framingham History Center in Framingham, Massachusetts. I came on board 15 years ago, and the board knew that I had development experience, I could write grants, and they needed somebody to help them with an RFP that the town had issued for these 3 historic properties on Framingham Center Common. And the History Center was in these buildings, and that's how I basically got involved. And I have been, you know, involved with the leases on these buildings. We have 50-year leases on them, et cetera, et cetera. But I actually had no museum experience. And I will never forget going to my first NEMA conference and sitting in the keynote session thinking, what am I doing here? And, but NEMA has always been such a treat and such a wonderful part of my professional development, as well as learning on the job. But common sense dictated to me that we had far too much stuff in our collection. We had a bloated collection. All of the things that Rainey's talked about. Our collections committee was basically going on, their scope of collections was if it was even related to Framingham in any sense, or if we didn't have a duplicate, we could take it into the collection, which was crazy. And we were just amassing way too much stuff and doing absolutely no de-accessioning. I'll never forget when one of the members of my collection committee came up to me and said, you know, Annie, I think we need to rent space. We need to rent off-site space. And I remind you, we have 3 buildings on the Center Common, one of which is a banquet facility, but really, I said, actually, I think we have plenty of space, but what I think the problem is here, we need more discipline in our collecting. So we had a serious logjam. And once again, I went to a NEMA conference and I heard about this concept called active collecting, probably from Rainey. And I came back and I did my research and I found the Active Collecting Manifesto on the website. And I was totally psyched. I thought, this is what we need. And this is what I want to make happen here. And I'll just read you one line from that manifesto that particularly resonated with me. How is it that we distinguish degrees of significance when we deal with individual objects, and yet we're paralyzed into inaction when we look at an entire collection? Paralysis describes where we were at. And I don't think it was hard for my board to understand this paralysis, because I literally am sitting in my office and above my head is a massive costume collection that literally I had probably been talking about for years, and how I just felt this pressure from above, like, we don't know what's in this collection, we're not properly storing it, we just need to do something with this. So I don't think it was difficult for me to convince our board that we needed to adopt this manifesto. And we did do that in 2016. And we posted it on our website, and I immediately was able to convince 2 individual donors that we needed to hire a collections manager to start working on this collection and go through it and figure out what we had and how to better store it. At the same time, we were also looking for a new curator. And so the Active Collecting Manifesto was a part of the job description. And Stacen, who became our new curator, remembers coming to the interview, and I was like waving that thing around, and it was a big part of the interview. And I'm very happy that she was excited about it, because she's been a terrific find. So I'll let Stacen take over from there.
Yes, thanks, Annie. So when I interviewed for this position at the History Center and Annie had this manifesto in her hand, it inherently made sense to me. I specifically don't come from a collections management background. I come from a public history background, which is very story focused. And I always came into museums thinking of museum collections as tools and not as a purpose. They're tools that we use to tell our stories, not the end all and be all of the reasons for a museum's existence. So I was coming in and I was really excited to work in an environment that was sort of actively taking this process on. What I didn't know coming in was that the collections committee that I'd be meeting was much more collecting and collections focused than I was. It was made up of volunteers, antique stealers, avid collectors, enthusiasts, and they had a very different approach and concept of what the collection was than I did. And when I came in, I didn't have this active collecting scope that Rainey talked about. I didn't have a tiering document. All I had in hand was that manifesto, which the board had adopted maybe a week before I started. And buy-in from the very top, but not buy-in with the collections committee that I would be actively working with. So that period began, my early years at the History Center were my De-Accessions trial by fire period. And this period was very much focused just on De-Accessions, specifically in the costume collection. And we did another mass De-Accession of a collection called the Smith Collection that Annie will talk about in just a minute. And basically, I just went about trying to, I just started trying to whittle down the costume collection in all of the ways that made the most sense. And of course, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit, items with no real provenance, items that were absolutely destroyed. And even at the very beginning, getting rid of that low-hanging fruit with my collections committee was very challenging. It was like by the skin of my teeth that I could get them to let go of like a single shattered silk dress that was in tatters and we never could have put on a mannequin or displayed in any reasonable way. And as I was trying to just sort of force the process of de-accessions to become more of a comfortable muscle memory for them, I did find a bunch of little strategies along the way that were very helpful in getting them to learn how to think of our collection more actively. And the first strategy that was really helpful was just what you see here, large de-accession reviews. Reviews of many, many items all at once, where many similar items were laid out all next to each other so that they could be seen as sort of the mass of items that they were. Sometimes it meant pulling out good examples of a similar item just to let them see what it was that we still had that was going to help us tell an important story. And also by laying all of these items out at once, we really gave the collections committee an opportunity to sort of have that little emotional connection and the time to say goodbye to the objects that I think that they really, really craved. That was a really great tool as we were sort of working through this. And when I brought them more objects at once, I had a lot more success in de-accession. And another little strategy that I thought was really helpful was formally creating an education collection. People were bandying around the concept of de-accessioning items and then moving it to an education collection, but there was no formal framework for what that was. But we do have a very robust third grade program at the Framingham History Center. And we've been moving in a very hands-on direction with that program. And the idea that an object that was removed from the collection could be reused in this sort of cornerstone of our institution was actually very appealing to the collections committee. But you do need to say, okay, this is what an education collection would consist of, because otherwise you end up with a collections committee that wants to send everything to the education collection, and you're actually not removing any weight from your own shoulders. You're just sort of shifting the burden maybe a little lower to your hips, but you're not getting rid of it in quite the same way that you might want to be. So these were the things that I was doing. Honestly, this was just sort of a brute force period. And there was another mass de-accession that we did during this period of a collection called the Smith Collection. And I'm going to let Annie tell you a little bit more about that because she had a long history with it.
Yes, the Smith Collection is a collection of Japanese artifacts, including some of these netsuke, that were amassed by a very wealthy Framingham resident who lived downtown, and I can picture him getting on the train and riding into Boston and going in and purchasing these items and coming back, and he had a huge display of these items in his home. So when just from the very beginning of my tenure here, I heard about this collection, how important it was to Framingham, how important it was to tell the story of a man of great wealth, et cetera, et cetera. It was literally the third rail. You couldn't even mention the concept of de-accessioning this. And I believe there were 900, Stacen, correct me, 900 pieces?
Yeah, it was 900 plus pieces, yeah.
Yeah, 900 plus pieces. Again, above my head, but a little further over in the building. Another collection that it killed me that these things were up in an attic. We didn't know what we had. We knew it was a beautiful collection, and it really didn't relate to Framingham history. We didn't need this many pieces to tell the story of this collector. And so I basically was emboldened. I think the board was ready. I mean, we'd gone through a series of board members. The people who were just, oh, this is such an important collection, it should never be broken up. Well, it already had been broken up, as we learned, and they were sort of in the background. And I took the opportunity to, with this active collecting manifesto, to get an appraisal and to move forward with de-accessioning most of the collection. We decided to keep a representative part of the collection, and Stacen did a great job of that, working with an auctioneer. But we did an exhaustive search for the right auctioneer who knew what this collection meant. And I just felt that here were pieces that we didn't understand, and the people out in the world, there are lots of people who would treasure these pieces, and they should be out there. So we wrote a letter to our membership, and we essentially brought them in on the de-accessioning process. And we were very, very transparent. We wanted to make sure people understood what we were doing, why we were doing it. And we also had the auctioneer he sponsored a luncheon for us, as you can see down here, where he talked about the collection. And as Stacen said, it was sort of a way of saying goodbye. And also inviting people to come to the auction. I suppose we shouldn't say that, but in any case, it was a great opportunity. And I have to say that after after the auction, I heard nothing. I heard nothing after we sent this letter. I had actually one naysayer who had been sort of on my back for years. He said, "You're doing the right thing. It's about time. This is great." So that was a major success for us. And I was emboldened, and I went to, I saw that Rainey was doing an active collections workshop in Natick, and I went to that, and I was just, it was wonderful, because this was more than a philosophy. This was a process. There were templates. There was a book. I was so excited about the book, and bought books for my board members, Stacen, the collections committee, and I actually read it and learned a lot. And the other thing that I was really excited to learn about was writing the poetic scope of collections. And this was something that I had been looking for years. Yes, we had a collections policy, but we didn't have a scope of collections in it. And when I asked for it, I got this is what we have in our collection. I didn't have this is why we have what we have, and this is what we want to collect and the stories that we want to tell. So this was a wonderful opportunity. And Stacen and our assistant director and I, and a member of the collections committee, sat down to write this scope of collections. It's not an easy process. And we tried to be poetic. It's probably not as poetic as I would have liked, but we tried. It was very interesting that the person who was representing the collections committee was immediately overwhelmed with the process. She just couldn't cope. And it was like, fine, no problem. But it was a hint. And it was a hint that the collections committee really didn't get it yet. And even though we had worked on, we were de-accessing these two major collections, they needed to be brought on board in a much more, in a better way. And I think Stacen will speak to that.
Yes. Yeah, the development of this collecting scope was probably the beginning of a more thoughtful period for us in our approach to active collecting. It was less sort of just like brute force de-accessions because there's too much. It was also thinking about how holistically the organization can start to come into an active collecting process, and how we can bring the collections committee on board as well. Because it was in the presentation of this collection scope to the committee, after we had developed it, the staff had mostly developed it, that I could see that they didn't understand what exactly it was that we were doing. They had read the manifesto, they had been given access to the book, but we actually hadn't taken the time that we needed to really sit the whole committee down and fully explain everything to them. So the first thing that I did with them was just, when I gave them this scope of collections and they looked at me like I had 3 heads, I decided to do an exercise with them sort of then and there. And I had them look at the scope of collections, which this is just a sample. It's actually much longer than this, but it didn't all fit. And I had them find different criteria in the scope and identify collections or collections items that we had that they thought fit into that criteria, told that specific story. And as they were doing this exercise, we were sort of taking this poetic approach and translating it into the much more literal approach that they had always been taking to collections. And they were starting to really understand it. And actually, as we were going through this scope and they were identifying collections and collections items that fit multiple bullet points on our scope of collections, that was really the first inkling that they had and our first sort of jab at the concept of tiering the collection and saying, okay, this is a top tier item, this really sings, this isn't. And so the next step that we did with them was I decided that they really needed a formal training. So I put together a formal training myself, and we convened a special meeting of the collections committee just for the purpose of this training. And it was a combination of an overview of the concept of active collecting, an overview of sort of the way I saw it fitting into our organization. And then there were some exercises that I did with them to make it a little more active, a little more engaging for them. So some of the exercises were just like really fun ones to get them rolling, to get them excited. I asked them to think of totally creative, out of the box, ways that we could use our current collections. And they had a lot of fun doing that. And some of them were a little more practical. The biggest practical exercise that we did and the culmination of this training was the development of this tiering document that you see here. The collections committee actually helped us develop the different criteria for our tiering document. We came to them with the general concept of what it would look like. And we asked them to tell us, well, what are the important things for us to think about as we're tiering an object? And you'll see, different than the tiering worksheet that Rainey showed you earlier, our tiering worksheet is actually a worksheet with columns where our collections committee can look at an item and put check marks in boxes according to the different criteria, and then actually add up the numbers and determine where that objects fall within the tiering document. And of course, we only have 3 tiers instead of 5. We decided to opt for a very broad middle tier rather than sort of fine-tuning them. And then eventually, hopefully, maybe we'll actually explore the middle tier a little more and get more into the nuances of that. But this has actually been an incredibly helpful document for the collections committee, because again, they were very sort of old school collections focused, very literal about their collecting processes. And using this worksheet has really helped them translate their approach, or it offers a translation between the active collections approach and their approach, and they can really get hands-on and see something concrete. And then we thought about the ways that we need to put tiering into action in other aspects of our organization. And actually, we brought in some sort of poetic interpretation of some top tier items. There's no place where sort of the top tier is quite literally on display in our collection as it is with our latest exhibition, which is called Framingham's Top 10. Annie was a big part of the visioning that brought that exhibition into our organization. So she's going to give you a little background on that.
So I, back to our buildings, we have succeeded in sealing the envelope of these buildings. We've halted the demolition by neglect, but we haven't started in on making them beautiful on the inside yet, because we needed to figure out how to make these buildings and these spaces work in concert. And we've been chasing our tails forever, it seemed like forever. And I came up with the idea of, why don't we talk to the experts? And so I got a grant and we were able to bring in the directors of local museums to come and give us a day of visioning. And work with us. And I literally was like, okay, here's your space. What would you do with them? But we had people from Newton, Beverly, Concord, the Discovery Museum, the Danforth Museum. It was wonderful. And one of the major upshots at the end, as we were doing our wrap up, well, actually throughout the tour, we heard, this is Framingham? You have this? And we were like, yes, this is Framingham. And so they were so impressed with our collection. And in the end, I think it was Neil Gordon who was like, you have to have a top 10 exhibit and you have to have everybody in Framingham. You have to let everyone in Framingham know what you have. And we took it to heart. And I think our staff, I remember at the end of it, we took a walk around the common a couple of times and we were sort of decompressing, and everybody was so excited about this idea. And so Stacen and our assistant director brought the community into a tiering process by having them vote on their 3 favorite pieces that they thought should be in this exhibit. We took away 3 pieces which we knew would get all the top votes automatically. We were like, forget it, we're not putting these in. So we put out on the web 19 different items and photographs and some short description. And I think we got about 430 responses. And the top 3 community picks ended up being a Native American deed that we have, a bill of sale for a 2-year-old enslaved child named Phoebe, and our 1808 watercolor depiction of the Center Common, which was great. And so we brought the community into the process, and we opened the exhibit in October of 2019, which brings us into 2020 and our active collection story now.
And 2020 has been a very interesting year for us. So actually, I want to say maybe 3 weeks before we were forced to shut down due to COVID-19, we had a real moment of clarity from a structural engineer who came into another building of ours, the old Academy building, which is where the bulk of our collections are actually stored. And he looked at the columns on the first floor of the building. We have a photo of one on the left here, and actually that is a straight-on photo of a crooked column, not a crooked photo of a straight column. And he said, those columns are made of wood and they're bowing. You need to relieve half the weight on the second floor. And so we were thrown into a little bit of a panic, and literally the Wednesday before we closed, and Wednesday was my last day of work that week, we had movers in help us moving half the collection off of that floor and into other spaces around our building. And at that moment, we also realized that we needed to place a moratorium on incoming collections, because there was no way that we could be taking on new collections when we were still figuring out how we could possibly house the collections that we had in our space. And during that time, during this past, what's been since March that we placed the moratorium, so almost a year, not a year yet, we've made it through a lot of our collections processing, and it's been really great. It's been a huge relief not to have to process incoming collections while we're just trying to figure out what we have. We've de-accessioned just in the past 2 months, nearly 100 redundant objects that we didn't really need to be housing in our collection. And it's been so incredible to have the time to go through the collection and discover exactly what it is that's been weighing us down. Because we didn't even know what was weighing us down. We just knew that it was too heavy. And being able to let that stuff go has been hugely beneficial to us. The work is still ongoing. We'll probably be doing this for a long time. The collections are huge. There's something like, our past perfect records, the output is something like 19,000 plus records. And I still see a lot of places where we can improve in implementing an active collections approach. We still have a very, or before we placed the moratorium, we still had a very passive approach to obtaining incoming collections. Anyone who walked in with something for us, we would consider. And we probably still don't even know all of the items in our collection that deserve spots in our top tier, because we just haven't seen them. It's possible we haven't seen them in years. It's possible a box hasn't been opened since before I started, and there's something incredible in there. So between those two things, I see plenty of work for me to continue developing this process. So we've just sort of distilled our story into sort of 10 more concrete strategies here for you that you can look over, and we'll leave here for you to look over as Annie gives you a little bit of a pep talk to get you going.
So I just want to remind you of my inexperience in museum work. and how this active collecting policy has really emboldened me as sort of a newbie in this world to move our organization forward. I just want to say it's been the right thing to do for the Framingham History Center. And we have been learning the whole way. I mean, it was really interesting getting this workshop together because I realized that the first phase of our de-accessioning, those two large collections, was me just pushing it. You know, I had my manifesto and, you know, we were just going to do this, and I had the board behind me. And then came the softer, the more contemplative, the Stacen approach, working with the collections committee. And I realized the difference, and we're really at the beginning of our journey here on active collections, as you can see. But again, if I can do it, you can do it, and don't be afraid to do it. It's a great journey, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating what will come up, and so I can just implore you to get started with it. And of course, if you have any questions for any of us, please let us know. But I think we do have some time for some questions. I don't know, have you guys been monitoring the questions?
We do have time for questions. It's very exciting because we have in the past come in pretty late on finishing this program. And there have been some questions showing up in the Q&A. Let's see.
Yeah, there was Stacen. First of all, hooray for Stacen and Annie and all their hard work. So there was a question that came up in the chat about de-accessioning, and I think it's one a lot of people end up asking. So let's start with that one, and then and particularly since it's also not in the Q&A section, then we can switch the Q&A section and just go down the list. So there was this question about dealing with controversy around de-accessioning, and this is an important thing to address. You know, there have been some high-profile cases of de-accessioning where communities got, you know, really upset about things being de-accessioned, and I find that across the field, those high-profile cases tend to worry museums that they shouldn't do any de-accessioning at all because it will always create controversy. And I just want to point out that generally when it's a high profile cases in the news, it's because the collection is quite valuable in terms of market value. Often it's fine art that commands a whole lot at auction, so a known artist. So if you think about the Berkshire Museum example recently that we're all familiar with in New England, you know, they were thinking about auctioning, you know, a Rockwell and, you know, things that, you know, named artists we all know. So much of the de-accessioning that is actually a really healthy part of museum work. It's just, you know, the healthy ongoing weeding of your collection over time, the compensating for, you know, no collections committee makes a great decision every time. And so the healthy, you know, sort of like balancing and compensating for decisions that weren't made, you know, as well as they could have been the first time around, for changes and new knowledge and all those kinds of things. They, you know, they happen all the time without controversy. And I think that the example that Annie and Stacen provide from Framingham is you know, is a case in point. And that, you know, often the stuff in active collections that's in tier 5 that we're really encouraging folks to de-accession is not valuable stuff. It's very run-of-the-mill stuff. And in fact, that's the reason it needs to be a de-accession, because it's so run-of-the-mill, it doesn't have a lot of meaning for your community. And it's duplicates. It really only particular, because this is so much a case with local historical societies, and I know a big part of our audience today is local historical societies. It's things that happen to be owned in your community, but really has very little to do with your community's story, and in fact is owned by place, by people all over the US, is very, dime a dozen. And so there's lots of de-accessioning that can be done without controversy. And the key really is to always be transparent about it. And I think, Annie and Stacen provided a great model for how you're transparent, and to realize that, in my experience talking to folks all over the country, so much of this is, it's issues and decisions that any reasonable person would side with, the kind of stuff we're talking about, active collections. Reasonable people all over the country have been watching those 3 societal trends unfold, and they understand we're not living in a time of abundance anymore either. They understand we're living in a time where we need to make different choices. And if you let them in on that thought process, they will understand. And I like to tell a story about a small historical society in Colorado. The collections manager, I met her at a conference, and they had something like 18 typewriters in their collection for this small local historical society. And most of them really just that case that they happened to have been owned in this local community, had nothing to do with the real history of this community. It's not like they were the birth of the typewriter or anything like that. And so at an annual meeting, the collections manager brought all the typewriters out and put them on the table and said to the membership, "We've got too many typewriters. We don't need this many." And the membership was full of reasonable people who were like, "Yeah, you've got too many typewriters. Yeah, that's totally fine. De-accession most of them." And so that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. So with that question answered, Stacen, what other questions? I know there's some that I saw that are specifically for you. Do you want to tackle them?
Yeah, so there are a few in the Q&A I saw. One says, Stacen has an exposure to a large collection, also changed her feeling about the value of collections. I think my first response to that would be to say that I always thought that collections were valuable. I think that they are an extremely powerful and important storytelling tool. I think, but I think it's a mistake to think that a collection is a reason for being in and of itself, for an institution to exist in and of itself. I think that if an institution is going to collect, it should be with an eye towards using that collection as a tool in some way to people, to educate, to give people experiences that they wouldn't get otherwise, and not just for the sake of having things. And so that's sort of why active collecting just sort of inherently made sense to me when I was coming in, because I already just sort of had that attitude and was already so story focused and so people focused in my study of history and in what I was interested in doing. And then somebody else also asked, what do you do with the De-Accessions? Which was one of the first things that I did when I came on. The collections committee that I was working with did not have a lot of formalized procedures. They weren't even keeping meeting minutes at the time that I came on. So one of the first things I did, because I came from a position where I was an executive director before I was a curator, and I had spent a lot of time with committees and with a board of directors, I put a lot of procedures into place and just put things into writing as official policies. And creating a disposition of de-accessioned items was one of the first policies that I created. And so we have a level of priorities. So the first priority, after we de-accession something, is to see if it would be useful in our education collection. If it's not going to be useful to us in any way, if the donor or the donor's family is still around, we offer the object back to them. Then we prioritize sending it to another public organization that might be interested in having it. And we actually have had some art that we've de-accessioned and donated to the Danforth Museum, which is they're our neighbor, literally right next door to my building in Framingham. And that was a really great thing that we were able to sort of do that with them. And then after that, we prioritize sending it to a public auction so that it's possibly available to as many members of the public as possible when we're selling it. And then after all of that, if nobody wants it, it's of such low value that an auctioneer won't take it. We either put it in our publicly advertised annual tag sale, or throw it away if it's actual garbage, which is sometimes the case. And that's very hard for people to wrap their minds around. But I would never ask a person to hold on to you know, a piece of like fully like tattered clothing in their house because they couldn't find someone else to take on that clothing and nobody else was interested in it. You know, sometimes there's just nothing else to be done with it. It's lost its life. It's outlived its usefulness. And actually very few things have been thrown away in our case. We had a box of insects, like a natural history collection, and almost all of the insects were fully desiccated and broken down and destroyed. And what the head of my collections committee said, somebody will buy that at the tag sale. And somebody did. It was astonishing, probably for about 25 cents. But yeah, so we do have a formal order in which we do dispositions. Let's see, what else is there? Let's see, we have another question. The criteria tiering worksheet is great. Did bringing the collections committee and community in on the process help expand understanding in other areas of for the community? Annie, do you want to take that? Or should I speak to that?
I think that question is, did you, by helping the community understand your collections, did it get them curious about other things going on with your collection, or was it a door to open to greater, communication with them in some way?
So I'll just speak to the fact that the Framingham Heart Study, hopefully I imagine many of you have heard of it. It puts Framingham on the map internationally. We had nothing from the Heart Study that we could actually put on display because it's a very confidential study. And we ended up actually borrowing some things from them. And so, but people were asking, why don't you have something from Sarah Clay's? Why don't you have something from the Heart Study? And so it was our way of telling them that we didn't really have anything in the collection that we thought would be exhibitable. And so that was interesting because we got feedback for what we didn't have. So yeah, I think, and I also think that when we closed our doors, Stacen immediately got on making our top 10 exhibit, putting it up online. And we had 10,000 hits on our website after she did that, on our site after she did that. So something was working. I think maybe it was a culmination of a lot, and there were also other things that we were putting out there, like COVID-19 template that Stacen created. But so the community is I mean, we would never get 10,000 visits in this building in 10 years. So maybe 10 years, yes, but it was a huge impact. I don't know if that answers your question.
And I think another part of that is that, putting the Poetic collecting scope statement online to be transparent about that and what you do collect is something I really encourage folks to do. And, another way of starting this conversation with members of your community about what your collection is all about. I think we all are familiar, particularly with small museums, of a colleague was just telling me yesterday about something being left on their doorstep, right? The doorstep donations. And there's so many cases of, again, we are surrounded by stuff, drowning in it in our personal lives. There's so many people out there who, don't know what to do with all their own stuff, feel guilty about it, needing to go somewhere special, try to give it the Historical Society. There's sort of a way that we are a safety valve. Historical Society collections are a safety valve in a system, a societal system that's overloaded with stuff. And so if you are very transparent and clear about what you do collect, and this Poetic collecting scope statement frames it in terms of real, true meaning to their community, I think making that available in public knowledge so that people have a better sense of what is really of value for your community, it can be really important. And also when you're doing de-accessioning is a way of framing it that it's not just a subtraction. It's not like we're losing all this stuff in the collection and suddenly it's this big loss. It's that we are weeding so we can focus on the top tiers, the stuff that really matters, and making that really present and big for your organization.
I think with that, we are at 2:31, so we have to stop because I think they probably need to get this channel ready for another session. Were there any questions? I don't know. Were there any? I don't think there were any questions we didn't get to. I think we looked at all of them.
I think we're good.
Yeah.
You can also keep chatting too.
The chat.
It's just I need to close the Zoom room.
Yeah, okay.
I'm the one in the back of the room. I'm the one in the back of the room pointing to my wrist.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Do we want to just leave the chat open, and if people ask questions, we can revisit the chat and answer them?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming. We're happy to talk this all day and all night. Bye, everyone.
We believe in you. Good luck.
Yes, you can do it.
Thank you.